Okay, welcome to this next in our series of the Manchester Classical Association Seminar Public Lecture Series. And this evening it's a very huge pleasure to welcome one of our Manchester colleagues, Dr. Roberta Mazza, who's a lecturer in Greco-Roman material culture at the University of Manchester, where she's been since 2009, after having worked and studied at Santa Barbara and Bologna. She's published far too many items for me to mention here around papyrology, the ethics of use of papyri from a range of periods in the Greco-Roman and late antique periods. And she's very well known to those of us who are interested in controversies around collection and discovery and transmission of papyri and exchange of them. So we can read quite a lot about that in some of the very public-facing work that she's done over the last few years, which has been hugely influential in changing the ways that we deal with papyri. So on that note, I'm going to hand straight over to Roberta. Thank you for joining us, Roberta.
Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be in Manchester, also in the even if in this format. Now, I will share my screen. It's the panic moment. I think we are fine. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to give you a quick overview of some of my research through the discussion of 3 case studies. But before that, I would like to introduce a little bit of general points. First of all, in my title, I've used the term illicit, which is, of course, a legal term, licit and illicit. However, what I am interested in is more than the legality or illegality of the trade and the history of the market. Mainly when the cultural and ethical dimensions of this peculiar trade in antiquities, in particular in manuscripts. Of course, the trade has been, still is, regulated by national and international laws. A key moment, usually for academics, is this 1970 when the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property was issued by the UNESCO, and then nations took care of improving their legislations in that matter. I would like to quickly remind, however, every one of us that nations had legislations already in place. In particular, you have here a slide with the main laws regulating the antiquities, not only the trade, but also the antiquities per se of Egypt that were all in place since 1835. So it's not that the market was unregulated before 1970. So what I'm going to do is to provide, as I provide you with 3 case studies that I've chosen according to this sort of periodization through which I look at discoveries, collecting, purchase, acquisitions of papyrus manuscripts. So I distinguish a first phase from, let's say, the Napoleon's conquer to the 70s with the legislation that I was recalling before. And I see this as the colonial phase where purchases were booming. There was a trade also before, and there were discoveries of papyri even before, but that was a small endeavor. It's only since, I would say, 1877 that the export, acquisitions, and also the searches through archaeological excavations really took off. Then I see a second period that goes from the 70s to 2011, that I call post-colonial phase, when, you know, more careful legislation was issued in various nations, and also when post-colonial studies took off and academics too started thinking about our achievements in the colonial phase in Egypt and elsewhere. Then something happened really around 2011 for Egypt, when the Arab Revolution brought instability in North Africa, the Middle East, and really we have seen a dramatic increasing in looting, trafficking, and so forth, so on. This was noticed not only by law enforcement, but also academics who actually are keeping an eye on the market or are excavating actually in Egypt. So I've chosen 3 case studies that are connected with each one of these 3 phases. Let's start, and since, and since this is the classical association, I've chosen 3 famous classical pieces. The first one is the Bacchylides book roll that is nowadays in the British Library. You can see the entry of the catalog online, and you would see that this is a long scroll that is now divided in 6, I think, different frames. This is a luxury book and an astonishing discovery, because it brought to light verses of Bacchylides previously unknown. Who did bring this piece back? This was one of the many acquisitions of Wallis Budge at the time of the purchase, 1896, keeper of the Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities of the British Museum. We have a first-hand account from Wallis Budge, besides also other testimony of this story, and the story is quite astonishing. So it is November 1896. It's the beginning of the season for curators, archaeologists, Egyptologists who spent months excavating in Egypt and at the same time hunting antiquities and papyri too. Wallis Budge is telling this story. He is chasing for papyri, he's buying a lot. And then it starts this new finding story. Whilst I was concluding my negotiations for these in a native house, a man from Meir, who did not belong to the company of dealers with whom I was acquainted, came into the room carrying a tin box and said he had a papyrus to sell. He opened the box and produced a roll of light-colored papyrus with many fragments which had been broken off it, and when one end of the roll was laid flat, I saw that it contained several columns of Greek uncials. I never know how to pronounce it. In the course of our talk, he told me that he had found it in a square coffin in a tomb in a hill close to Meir, which is this village nearby Hermopolis, Middle Egypt. There were many coffins in the tomb, but they had all been opened and ransacked in ancient times, and he had found nothing worth carrying away except this papyrus, which was lying between the feet of a broken mummy and the end of its coffin. He then went on to tell me that the prices of Greek papyri had risen greatly and that all the world in Cairo and Luxor was asking for them. These things I knew to be absolutely true, for there were several agents for continental museums and 2 or 3 well-known English archaeologists who were scouring Cairo for Greek papyri. We know from the journals of Petrie that, in fact, Petrie was chasing that papyrus too with Sayce, the Orientalist and classicist, who wanted that badly for the Bodleian, but Budge had better luck. So Budge leaves a deposit from his own pocket with his money and goes to Upper Egypt to check the British Museum excavations and other things. Then when he is back, he found a letter from Mounted Thompson, who was in charge of the manuscripts department of the British Museum, that says to him, buy it, because it's very important. He was sent a few lines that Budge was able to read, but not to identify. However, something has happened in the meanwhile, that is, the Antiquities Service heard of the availability of this scroll, knew that the dealer who was trying to sell was doing that illicitly, and of course wanted to stop the sale and keep the papyrus at the Museum of Cairo. So what does Budge do? He wanted that in any case and buys the papyrus even before the museum took a decision for it. And actually, as you can see from his own words, the British Consul General at the time, so Lord Cromer, even intervened, saying that buying of the papyrus was causing a sort of international diplomatic disaster. So he needed really to stop. But there is even more. I knew that the threat, so he was threatened by Lord Cromer to be reported to the British Museum. I knew that the threat was no idle one. So to avoid all complications and the possible loss of the papyrus, I determined to buy it for myself and to pay for it out of the sum of money with which, in view of such a contingency, I had provided myself in London. The trustees' regulations do not permit any of their servants to make a private collection of any class of antiquities with which his department deals. But as Greek papyri went to the Department of Manuscripts and not to the Department of Egyptian and Assyrian Antiquities, I broke no official rule in buying the papyrus for myself. The counter move which the officials of the Service of Antiquities made was to warn the customs authorities at Port Said and Alexandria to keep a sharp lookout for antiquities in passengers' luggage, and the postal authorities at these places were ordered to examine carefully all postal packets for England. So the next problem that Budge, who doesn't care of, you know, the warning from the diplomats, nor for the perils to be put under some sort of investigation by the trustees is that to illegal exporting the papyrus. So what does it do? As it was hopeless to attempt to send the papyrus out of Egypt, packed in a box, I cut it up into sections and laid them between layers of photographs and so forth, so on. So he cuts a manuscript, causing damages to it. In fact, it had to be remounted and so forth, so on, and smuggle it through the custom. Back to London, he has even more problems because he has this papyrus that was acquired by himself, not by the museum. So a fortnight later, it's now the spring of 1897, I gave the papyrus into the hands of the principal librarian, and the trustees of the British Museum purchased it at their next meeting from a connection of mine who signed the treasury warrant for payment and gave it to me. The papyrus contained nearly 40 columns of the text of the Odes of Bacchylides, a great lyric poet who flourished in the first half of the 5th century BC, and the experts thought that it was written about the middle of the 1st century BC. Sir Richard Jebb told me that he thought it was worth more than all the other things I had acquired for the museum put together. His works were hitherto unknown except for a few disjointed fragments. So basically, what they had to do once back was a sort of fake provenance for the papyrus to enter into the British Museum, and then it was moved later on to the British Library. I would like to draw your attention on the fact that, of course, this idea that a masterpiece of the classical tradition had to be back somehow to Europe, to England in this case. This is the mindset of the time. But most astonishing of all, in my opinion, is the current entry in the catalogue of the British Library online, which actually has as a provenance the one forged somehow, provided by Budge. So on the one hand, it seems that we accept without any doubt the provenance story provided by the dealer, which is highly questionable because, as scholars have proven, for instance, Brenton Longbury's book on Christian papyri from Egypt has shown that many stories of finding were actually provided to Europeans to please them. So it's really, it's an interesting fact that we are just assuming that story is correct. And the other is that the papyrus for the British Library was purchased with other two items from this Mr. Emerson in May 1897. So there's no trace of the story that actually the same Budge tells. Okay, let's move now to the second period and to our second case, which is again a very famous piece that was acquired in 1996 by Yale University, the Beinecke Library, and was later published in edition. These are the new, again, previously unknown epigrams of Palladas, an author of the 4th century CE, which was basically known only through some mentions in the Antologia Palladina until that moment. If we read the edition, we see that a story is repeated that was provided by the dealer from where the codex was bought. The box of fragments, so it was purchased with other things again, was said to have come from a recently, that was in 1996, a deceased collector of Egyptian artifacts who formed the collection in the 50s and 60s in Geneva. So this is a very little provenance, if one at all, plus it seems undocumented. It's just a dealer who is saying that the Egyptian collection was formed actually in a period which keeps you safe from that date of 1970 that people tend to take as a sort of stamp of legality, but that is in fact, as Patty Gerstenblith explains us, an expert in cultural heritage legislation, does not mean that actually the papyrus is licit or illicit. You have to go much more in depth with, finding out the provenance. And what do we discover if we go online and look at the online catalog of the Yale Papyrus collection? We actually get to know that the dealer who sold this codex is a very, say, interesting one. Let's put it in this way. Galerie Nefer of Zurich is the gallery, now closed, where Frida Chacos, a famous dealer in antiquities from various places, was making her dealings. Frida Chacos has been convicted in Italy and investigated also in Cyprus and elsewhere, and she was the seller of the Duris Fiale that was returned to Italy by the Getty Museum because it was found that it was illegally obtained. She is also involved in the Judas Gospel Codex, which is another main case. And so this to say that it is not enough to have the word of, let's say, a dealer telling you a story. What you really have to have as both a library and an academic involved in a publication of a manuscript is really a chain of documented licit ownership and provenance. Let us move to post-2011, even if this case that I will outline started actually in 2009, when, while I was arriving in Manchester, Mr. Green, this evangelical Christian collector and owner of this famous arts and craft chain called Hobby Lobby in the US, decided to start collecting artifacts to be exhibited in a museum that actually opened in Washington, D.C. in 2017. I went I started being interested in the story of the Green Papyri and the Museum of the Bible after the announcement of the discovery, so to speak, of the new Sappho fragments, one of which is P. Sappho Obbing, nowadays disappeared. So for me, that papyrus simply doesn't exist, and the brothers' poem doesn't exist unless we will have the papyrus back. And the other fragments were purchased by Mr. Green, and then all of them were published in a very important journal in my field. The collection history of these fragments of the new Sappho has known a never-ending story of changes and different tales, so to speak. If you are interested in the entire story, you can go either in my blog or in the blog of Nongbri Variant Readings, and also reading an article that Mike Sampson has published in the last issue of the Bulletin of the American Society of the American Society of Papyrologists. Bit of confusion in my slide. So what has happened to the green papyri, including the green Sappho fragments? They have been given back to their legal owner, which is the people of Egypt. In March of 1 year ago, Mr. Green, while we were actually in the first lockdown, Mr. Green announced that they decided to return the astonishing amount of over 11,000 antiquities to Iraq and Egypt. And about a month ago, we have read in the newspapers that actually the 5,000 item, mainly papyri, but also some mummy masks and other items, which were from Egypt, have arrived back to Cairo. What do we know? So we know for sure that these papyri were illicitly sourced. In fact, we know who sold the Sappho fragments to Mr. Green. This was a friend of mine, actually. This Mr. Jakub Exioglu, that has sold many antiquities, not only Egyptian antiquities, through eBay, and also physically in Istanbul, in Turkey, and also in a flat in London that was in which many people went to see his items. So the Museum of the Bible has disseminated documents showing that actually the green Sappho fragments were part of a bigger lot of about 1,000 pieces that Mr. Green, Hobby Lobby, decided finally to agree to purchase on the 7th of January 2012, and were later recognized as Sappho. Okay, so we have the seller, but we don't really know from where the seller has sourced these papyri, although we might have some guesses, since we know that a lot of looting, as I was saying before, is going on, especially after 2011. A place that has been the target of a lot of this looting is Abu Zir el Melek, which is a village at the entrance of the Fayoum in the Hermopolite Nome. So it's Busiris for the Greco-Roman people. We know that some of the masks that Mr. Green has sent back are from typologies of masks that are documented coming from Abu Zir el Melek. Of course, we don't really know from where Sappho and the other papyri that Exioglu sold to the Green were from, but yes, this can be, you know, a suggestion at least. Okay, so these were my three cases, and I would say that the last is the one that ended with a sort of what I think is an happy ending, in which you know, we recognize that something illegal has happened and restitution is taking place. Although this is really a discussion ongoing what to do, especially with items that that arrived in Europe so many years ago. And as a sort of conclusion of this outline, I would like to recall some sort of bullet points. First of all, this illegal sourcing of antiquities with the illusion that we were rescuing them. This is a sort of salvage archaeology, while even in the case of badge, we have seen that actually the market has damaged really not only the archaeological context, because we don't know anything, and most probably the archaeological context has gone through those kind of damages that we see now, for instance, in Abu Sir el Melek. But we have someone who cut a papyrus. So this is something we have to think about. Of course, these the trade behind the trade, the illicit or gray trade, there is criminality. I can entertain you on the profile of the Turkish dealer, but I won't. Of course, there is from the side of scholars this idea that texts, in our case, are more important than people. I would like to stress that Monica Anna, the Egyptologist based in Cairo, has documented that at Abu Sir el Melek in 2015-2016, 25 children have died, 15 or 25, I never remember the numbers, but children died in the process of looting, excavating in the shafts that you see in the slides. So even as academic, we need to bear in mind that we are at the end of a chain that started and moves about in very dangerous and violent ways.